Good afternoon. Friends, thank you for being with us today as we remember with deep gratitude the life and work of Tom Tredway, and especially all of us that he meant to the community of Augustana College. He will be missed. We are gathered in this place of great meaning to the story of Tom's life. What we call today Wallenberg Hall was once the reading room of the Denkman Memorial Library. Coming here as a student, Tom would have used the card catalog not far from where we are seated now. When he was a professor, Dr. Tredway's students would come to this room to quietly make their way through the assigned readings. Or they might have had conversations in the basement lounge for more boisterous conversations about Florentine princes, Prussian kings, and what exactly, they would ask, is Western civilization after all. As president, he oversaw the complete remaking of this space from a quiet oasis to an elegant performance and lecture hall, whose walls have witnessed transcendent performances, heard the words of poets, Holocaust survivors, and even a future president named Barack Obama. As a historian who devoted his scholarly life to capturing and interpreting moments in time, President Tredway knew that every moment was transitory. In an essay that he wrote in 2017, he recalled that in the Augustana Lutheran congregation he had attended in upstate New York during his youth, a pastor would announce a death in a congregation by saying, "We are once again reminded that we are all but pilgrims and strangers here on earth." The essay's title, "No Abiding City," was taken from the 13th chapter of Hebrews, and I quote, "For we have here no abiding city, rather we seek after a city which is to come." Well, our coming together in this room today is an admission that our lives on this earth are impermanent. Let us also take this opportunity to remember a life well lived, one that is dedicated, as Tom Tredway's life was, to something far greater than himself. Let us be grateful for the many echoes of Tom Tredway's leadership at Augustana College. They go beyond the many buildings built and the many new programs added during his administration. His biggest impact, in my view, was the abiding belief that continues today that Augustana should remain true to its mission as a national liberal arts college. He hired a generation of dedicated faculty members and administrators, many of whom are here today, passionate about that same goal. He inspired a generation of students to think more deeply and more creatively. The impact of his vision will be felt by members of the Augustana community in the generations to come. Just as enduring, I think, will be the echoes of conversations we each had with Tom, whether on the sidewalks of the campus, after classes, while biking, in his office, or in my case, at the Village Inn. In our time here, let us acknowledge the ephemeral, yes, but let us also celebrate that which abides. Memories of a great leader, a great scholar, and a great friend. Welcome all.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, you raise up servants to do astounding work for the good of this world. We gather today to give you thanks for the life and work of our President Emeritus, Thomas Tredway. On the Augustana campus and expanding communities beyond, he has taught, led, and inspired generations of your children, young and old. We give you thanks for the ways in which Thomas Tredway's life has shaped our own, and we ask that your blessing be upon this gathering, and that his spirit might somehow be among us today as we celebrate a life well lived. Amen.
Psalm 100, a psalm of thanksgiving. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations.
Hello. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Liesl Fowler. I am Augustana, class of 1990. I've had the pleasure of serving as the Augustana College Registrar since 2004, and I've been a proud Augustana employee for 31 years. I was 10 when I was hired. I hope to make this time together a little uplifting, maybe a bit humorous. My apologies in advance to all of you who sit here on this beautiful spring day and have to listen to my ineloquent attempts to honor our friend, but I will do my best. You see, for those of you who know me well, know that I'm a bit of a sap, so don't be surprised if you see some tears, especially when it comes to Augie. Those who have called this place home for a very long time, as I have, nostalgia gets the best of me every time. I am one of those people that cries at Folgers commercials, you know, the one where the son comes home, right? I may have cried when Chandler and Monica got married, I'm not. I just want to say that I am prone to tears in both times of great joy and profound sadness, and I think today there are both of those things. Profound sadness for the life, friendship, and mind that will no longer be with us in flesh and bone, but great joy too. For the memories I hope we will all share with one another today and in the many years to come. So thank you for allowing me a few brief moments to share some of my memories of our friend Tredway. And that's really who he was, right? Tredway, not Dr. Tredway, not Tom, right? He was Tredway. And he had this funny way of referring to himself in the third person that way when he knew he'd ticked off maybe a faculty member, and he'd make fun of himself and say something like, well, there goes Tredway again, spouting off about his vision of the liberal arts. And I don't know if I have that right. You know, he had his palm up, right? His hand crammed into his tweed jacket, right? But he was maybe opening a way for conversation and punctuating with his hand like that. And maybe it was just a way to invite people to listen to a spontaneous sidewalk lecture. I was thinking about Tredway and what I might say, and mostly I was embarrassed about my little stories and how they would be in comparison to anything he might have said. I'm sure many of us in the room feel this way when we think about Tom. As we know, he could converse on literally any topic, to anyone, right? He could just speak from his heart and let his brilliant mind take over, with such ease and comfort. He could converse quite literally with kings and queens, and faculty, but also students and custodians and facility staff and our coaches, everyone he encountered. He could discuss Swedish politics just as comfortably as he could talk about the wing tee and Bob Reed's football program. When I was a student, there were so many urban legends about Tredway. The stories often involved him jumping out of his office window in Founders Hall to avoid a difficult conversation. I can't really imagine Tredway backing down from a conversation, but maybe he'd put it on simmer for a while. Many of you here may know if there was truth to those stories or not. I have memories of Tredway. Many of them involve him walking briskly into a room, almost skipping. If the room was quiet, he might be more likely to slide in along the wall. In many ways, Tredway has become mythology. Some tales we probably have embellished over the years, but I think he would have liked that. He probably embellished from time to time. I have many I could share, but I will share 3 in the ways that I knew him best. And hopefully they will remind you of the ways you have known him as well. So Tredway the teacher. I knew Tredway first as a student here in the late 1980s. I never had the opportunity to have him in class, but I think he was a teacher in most facets of his life. I feel like it was his natural state. As a student, who your college president is doesn't necessarily affect your day-to-day life. Apologies, Steve. But Dr. Tredway was very much a part of our daily life. He walked everywhere, all across campus, all the time, regardless of weather. I think more than once I saw him in bitter cold temperatures with his tweed jacket turned up, his hands crammed into his pockets, wherever he was headed. Sometimes, maybe in better weather, Clyde, his dog, do you remember Clyde? He was a tall, scruffy dog, exceedingly friendly, especially if you had scraps of food to drop his direction. He could be seen lounging about or waiting outside an academic building for someone to let him in. Sometimes he would sit right in front of the founder's doorway, so you had to actually step over him to get in. When I was a student, the Observer actually had a comic strip called Clyde, and it was about his daily life on campus. As a student, Clyde was our access point to the highest ranks of college administration, the college president. The casual way Clyde and Tredway were part of our daily lives made Tredway seem real and normal, especially at a time in our lives when, as students, nothing seemed normal. Everything seemed new and unfamiliar. Tredway and Clyde were welcoming us into Augustana's living room as if to say, "It's all good, come on in, have a seat." During my 4 years as a student, I often saw Tredway having conversations with everyone. Colleagues as they tried to keep up with his vigorous stride, or stopping a faculty member along the paths crisscrossing campus, or maybe a spontaneous metaphor involving German literature on the steps just outside Old Main. He seemed in perpetual motion, physically and intellectually. There was a lesson in every conversation, a moral to every story. So Tredway the colleague. Many of you know me as the college registrar. You may not know that in my before my current role, I served in the athletic department as many hats, but most recently as NCAA compliance officer, department chair, women's athletic director. During my coaching years in the 1990s, those of us who hung out north of 7th Avenue at Carver Center, we didn't see Tredway much. And honestly, that was pretty okay with us. We mostly had the budgets we needed to be successful, and he stayed out of our way. We kept our heads down, we made sure our student athletes went to class and did well, And we didn't stand up and brag about all of our accomplishments. Nothing we had was too extravagant. We're Lutheran after all. But certainly we got by with what we had. As a young coach myself, the thought of the college president lurking around my matches wasn't something I was too excited about, so his hands-off approach suited me just fine. But let me be clear, we didn't misinterpret this method as disinterest or lack of appreciation for our contributions to campus. Many of us received a handwritten note from time to time from Tredway, maybe after a particularly hard-fought win or a loss, maybe to our little green friends down the road in Bloomington, or a chance encounter in line for lunch might turn into a conversation about a matchup from weeks prior. He was paying attention. One such brief meeting while in line for a chocolate chip cookie concluded with Tredway saying to me, "Sure, we want you guys to get our fair share of wins, show the CCIW who we are and what we're made of, but above all else, we want our students to have an amazing experience. We want what you are doing to be a reason that they stay, why they love college, a piece of their degree. As president, I want to support our coaches and teams in making that happen. I hope you know that." And we did. As an invited guest to a board meeting one spring, I was explaining to a board member, probably not well, my role as athletic director and coach in attempting to convey the kind of important interactions and conversations I had with my student athletes every day. It wasn't completely clear if the board member understood the value I felt it brought to my player's life. Tredway unexpectedly joined the conversation just then to punctuate what I had said. "You know," he said, looking at the board member, "I deeply admire and respect someone who's willing to arrive at their job every day, knowing that their peers and employer will be able to see their successes and failures recorded in a very public way, by wins and losses, for everyone to judge. Most of us on this campus and in careers everywhere will never have to face that kind of very public scrutiny in our calling." Maybe he wasn't standing behind the dugout at every softball game or sweating on the deck of the Carver pool, but he got us. He appreciated us colleague to colleague, and he had our back. And finally, Tredway the administrator. This is the final story about Tredway speaks to his capacity for compassion and his power for observation. I mostly knew Tredway in this role. As gifted as he was with people in conversation, I'm not really sure he was all that comfortable in his administrative role as the top college administrator. He often seemed a little apologetic about the things he felt he needed to do in the best interest of the college. One day in spring, mid-1990s, Tredway was scheduled to perform one of these routine administrative duties in the athletic department. It had been scheduled to meet with our entire coaching staff over lunch, to which my knowledge had never happened before. The details of the meeting were shared in very brief note that came from Ethel. "Tredway, noon, Carver classroom, arrange for lunch." Okay. So we scurried around, we put the CPR dummies away, we exchanged our windbreakers for blazers, and we put out a lunch fit for the president. Ethel called about 5 minutes until the lunch hour and said a donor meeting was running late and it was holding him up, but he insisted that we start lunch without him and he'd join us soon. About 20 minutes into our lunch, just before we were uncomfortably eating without our guest, in clothes we'd rather not be wearing, Tredway breezed in. We awkwardly stood as he entered, really unsure what to do next. Completely apologetic for his tardiness, he could have launched immediately into the meat of the discussion. We didn't know it, but he was there to deliver rather bleak news about the need for some rather deep budget cuts across campus and was seeking our cooperation. But sensing our discomfort and anxiety surrounding this mysterious meeting, he instead insisted we sit down, resume our meal. He casually made himself a plate of food and he told us a story. You may have heard a version of this from Tredway himself, and I suspect the details may have been changed occasionally to suit any given audience, but it certainly wasn't changed to spare those involved. I won't do it justice, but here's the story he told us on that day. About a decade prior to that, mid-1980s, the campus was having the same kind of budget conversations we pretty much have to have annually now in higher education, right, Steve? Yes. The news had been shared across campus that each department needed to have some serious conversations about how to do their part to cut from their own budgets. At the same time departments were crunching their numbers, Tredway and his colleague John Kinshew from the advancement office were doing their part to court some rather large donors to help offset the increasing costs of running the college. An event had been planned at House on the Hill on a cold February night, where Tredway and Kinshu would wine and dine the prospective donors and encourage them to contribute to the enhancing college experience of every student. If you haven't been to this amazing home, House on the Hill is a beautiful mansion built in 1865, ish, with 15-foot ceilings covered beautifully with handcrafted wood on the ceilings, walls, floors, everywhere. On the dining room table, it had been set for 12 guests. The Augustana catering staff were in place. The feast was waiting to be served. In an adjacent room of some kind, probably another student group was also holding a meeting. They could hear muffled voices behind the doors. The weather had deteriorated all day, and eventually word came that the guests arriving from Chicago by plane would not make it that evening, and instead would be rescheduled for the following day. At a loss for what to do, Tredway explained that he and Kinshu decided it best not to let the food go to waste and suggested they go ahead and share a meal with the catering staff before everyone ventured out into the cold Rock Island storm. After some convincing, the staff reluctantly acquiesced to the invitation, but insisted on serving the meal as planned and would join them later. As Tredway told the story, at the same time, in the living room next to the dining room, the other campus group was beginning to break up. Tredway and Kinshu sat on either end of this expansive table, glasses full to the brim, serving platters with all kinds of dishes overflowing with the best delicacies the catering staff could offer. As the staff bustled about, filling up the table with many carefully selected dishes and prepared for the donors. Before the catering staff could be seated, the doors to the adjacent dining hall opened, where other meeting had been taking place. Expecting to see a group of young students spilling out into the hallway as they exited the house, Tredway and Kinshu looked up from their spread. Instead, they were very surprised to see the weary faces of everyone from the education department. As Tredway told it, the faculty members quietly put on their coats as they peered into the dining room at the banquet displayed before Tredway and Kinshu. Fresh from their 3-hour meeting discussing how they would make deep budget cuts to sacrifice for the college, cuts Tredway himself had requested just days prior, the weary faculty members with empty bellies quietly filed down the hallway and out into the stormy night. After the laughter from our staff subsided, Tredway said to the coaches, "Now that was an uncomfortable meal." He went on to thank the athletic staff for our time and explained that we needed to make some cuts, and he wanted us to play a role in how that looked. He stayed and conversed for at least an hour, making time for every individual coach for a private conversation. I'm certain he was late for his next meeting, but he was so keenly aware of where he needed to be at that moment. Had he approached the conversation in any other way, we would have felt ashamed for the lavish, expensive lunch we clearly could not afford, maybe a bit resentful for the cuts we'd be required to make, and certainly irritated at having to wait on the individual who called this meeting. But instead, by finding a path into our reality and matching our anxiety with his own vulnerability, we felt appreciated, understood, and validated. In the years since he retired, I saw Tredway often and Kate occasionally at a variety of functions. I'm sure he was with me as he was with each of you. He always asked about my family, said something kind and complimentary about the work that I had done when I worked with him. And then he always asked about my current work and what I was doing for the college. He was an intense listener and chose to focus on the present and what was new. His continual gift to each of us was his ability to help us each look ahead. I've been reading the many tributes to Tredway that have been circulating on Facebook and at the local regional papers and in emails. Our own Kai Swanson said in an interview for the local paper, "I don't ever expect to meet someone like him again." And he's so right. Tredway was unique. He was one of a kind. And for those of us who were lucky enough to have him share some of that time with us at Augustana, he was ours. I'd like to think that nostalgia for this place probably got the best of him from time to time as well. Thanks, Tredway. You will be missed.
I'm Ralph Radloff, literally the oldest friend of Tom Tredway. If you didn't have the clue before, I had hoped to hide my script in a notebook, but now this gives me away, I think, pretty badly. I've known Tom a long time. We used to spend a lot of time facing each other across a tennis net. In later years, we faced each other across the lunch table. I feel very honored to be able to speak at this ceremony in Tom's memory. It was only after I accepted this honor that it dawned on me that with that honor goes a rather large challenge. And the challenge is to try to make a speech that would do justice to such an unorthodox and extraordinary person. As I thought and read and wrote, the task turned into a pleasure because it took me back to the presence of Tom Tredway. I knew that was going to happen. It was a pleasure to be in Tom's company. Those of you who knew him have experienced it. Those of you who haven't, I'm sorry. One way to understand Tredway, I think, is to look at him in his context, where he was. And that's how I have constructed my talk today. The first time I saw Tredway was in the fall of 1968. I was a new faculty member, and he had just returned from a year of teaching in Canada. And I found him in the midst of his faculty friends who were celebrating that he was in their midst once again. The last time I saw Tom was on my iPad screen. We were at a meeting on Zoom with a number of other faculty members who were retired. He was enjoying our company as he spoke to us in his eloquent ways and friendly terms. My first and last memories of Tom were of him in the company of faculty friends. As I thought of him and tried to imagine what I could say in this ceremony, the term that came to my mind was first among equals. I think that puts him in his place pretty well. That phrase goes back to the Romans and usually refers to a member of an equal group who was given extraordinary respect, usually because he was older. In Tom's case, age was not the issue. He was among the equals respected automatically. It didn't matter how old he was. He seemed to me that term of first among equals fitted him very well, and his history at Augustana. It was obvious to me from the start that Tom was a recognized leader of the faculty. He was probably only an assistant professor at the time, but everybody at the meetings that we held would wait until Tredway let his opinion be known before we made up our minds. He was that effective in his opinions. When the position of Dean of Faculty became open in 1970, the thinking of most of the faculty was, who better than Tredway? Apparently, President Swanson felt the same way because he made Tom dean. 5 years later, the college board seconded that motion and elected Tom to be president. They must have thought, too, who better than Tredway? In 10 years, Tom had gone from assistant professor to president, a really amazing achievement. But at the time, it didn't seem so much because it seemed so ordinary. How else would the college move ahead but with Tredway? We were not surprised. Once again, we all thought, what or who better than Tredway? If that term had not been coined by the Romans, it would have had to been invented to describe Tredway, first among equals. We witnessed what happens when a person is first among equals. His equals see the qualities of that person, and they set him apart and above. So far, I've told you what I have seen in my first 10 years here with Tredway, the history of his rise to prominence. The obvious question then is, what does Tom have that made him such an unusual person? The kind of history with him at Augustana doesn't just happen accidentally. Two of Tom's gifts are so obvious that they scarcely need mentioning. His intelligence so wide and deep, his speech always deft and clear and effective. But those two qualities did not necessarily make one a leader. A third gift of Tom was his charisma. Charisma is the natural ability that attracts other people into one's orbit. People recognized that Tom had an attractive personality, an openness to others that made them feel good in his presence. I don't think that Tom ever entered a room of people and stood alone for more than 5 seconds. People were attracted to him. He had the effect on people, whether they were in singles or crowds. People wanted to hear him and experience his presence. His charismatic personality, with his intellect and speech, made him a truly extraordinary person, a natural leader. Tom's inauguration took place in the open air of the campus, followed by a picnic. How like him to put a light touch on a serious moment. In his address, he spoke of what this campus had meant to him, its lawns, its trees, its memories. But he spoke mostly of the people that made it so valuable to him. Students, janitors, administrators, secretaries, teachers, parents, alumni, neighbors, the founders, and even the children who played on campus. He valued them all. In his address, he signaled how he would handle his leadership. He would lead from the middle. All of these people around him, he wanted them to be there always. He was mindful of their needs and of their contributions. It was not uncommon to try to find Tredway in his office. That was the wrong place to look. He was always out on the campus somewhere, listening. That was another gift that Tom had, the gift of listening. He was out on the campus, his second office, listening to students, groundskeepers, plumbers, faculty, the people who were helping him run the college. He knew that he could not run the college by himself. He counted on those around him to help him make this college work. And he enjoyed being in the midst of all of them. After all, he liked to be in the midst of his equals. That is how he led, from the middle. He led the college for almost 3 decades. The college added students, faculty, buildings, endowments, and trees. The college grew in quality and in recognition. Augustana College had thrived, and so had Tom. We understand Tredway in one way by looking where he is. Look at his context, where he was in the middle of his equals, in the middle of the campus community. Continuing on that theme of understanding him in the midst of things, we look at his retirement. Tom and Kate could have gone anywhere to live, but they established their home in Hampton, Illinois, a small town north of the cities on the Mississippi River. No longer in the middle of things, now they were on the edge of things. Living on the edge meant that Tom could go either direction. One way led to the city and Augustana. The other led to the countryside and nature. He enjoyed them both. The environment, wherever he was, he enjoyed. So for him, it was a win-win. No matter where he went, he was enjoying life. The Tredway's home has evidence of what Tom did in retirement. The front of the house faces the river about 25 yards away. Through the picture window, you can see the wideness of the Mississippi River, and you can see the human endeavors to control it, the dam and the barges that chug by. Through the window, you saw nature and humanity at work. Aside from the river view, the living room is dominated by two huge, bulging bookcases. They symbolize his return to the life of a scholar. Now he was able to do research and write and lecture, or not. The garage housed his bike workshop, where he built bicycles from the frame up, even to attaching the spokes to the wheels. 6 bicycles stood by the sides. Kate assured me that all were in use, depending upon the terrain, pavement, gravel, off-road, etc. In the previous period, Tom showed a lot of interest in cars. It seemed that he bought a new car every year. He bought luxury cars, and he bought pickup trucks. But a bicycle was his favorite mode of transportation. On a bicycle, he was out in nature, traveling at a speed which allowed him to appreciate what he was passing. On a bike, he could experience the sounds, the smells, the sights of the farms, the forests, and the small towns he passed. He reveled in it. It is good to remember that in the last 2 decades of his life, Tom was able to enjoy life to the fullest in his home with Kate, in nature, in the company of friends, in books. I have 2 more he could have to talk about. He could have lived anywhere, but he and Kate chose Hampton. He could have chosen any profession. He could have been successful in any endeavor he chose. With his intelligence and his curiosity, he would have made a great scientist. But he chose history because he found human behavior more entertaining. Nature, though endlessly interesting, does not have the entertaining value of human beings. Human behavior, past, present, in groups or individually, that's what Tom enjoyed. And that's where he shone. The other he could have is he could have gone to other colleges. I don't know that any other college ever sought him, but I can't imagine that they didn't. He described his college as a place where he was educated and where he was awakened to the glory of human life and of the world. And that is what he tried to pass on to other generations, that they would awaken to the human drama and the world. It was good to be here when Tom was among us.
At one point in the last couple of weeks, I found myself wishing that I had gotten the chance to have Dr. Tredway as a professor. But then I quickly realized that I kind of did. Over the past 15 years, I received quite the education from Tredway as a junior colleague through serving together on a Historical Society board, book projects, and conferences. This involved a lot of reading, exchange of manuscripts, and even some seminar discussion. I also had the privilege of editing his regular column in Pietisten, a small journal in the Swedish Lutheran tradition. His poem translation of Madrigal by Nobel laureate Thomas Tranströmer was one of the many things I enjoyed reading from Tom when he sent it in to have it printed. I went back to my emails to see what he had said about it. He wrote simply, "It is a poem of which I have long been very fond. If you have room for it in the next issue, maybe you can use it. Please improve the translation if need be. Thanks for looking at it, Tom." I made no improvements. This got me reading some of the many other messages from Tom that I'd saved over the years. They were all encouraging, gracious, and wickedly humorous. One year in May, he wrote to verify that I had turned in my grades to the registrar on time, as that hadn't always been the standard practice of one of the previous occupants of my professorship. Tom furthermore explained that this eccentricity was how tortured genius works. I have no idea who he's talking about. Tom's essays are often comparative in nature and reflect everything I have heard about his presence and command in the history classroom. An amazing recall, an ability to synthesize the broad sweep of history effortlessly. When he visited my Martin Luther and the Reformation course a few years ago, I can assure you that he still had it. Much of my understanding of the deep things of Augustana College has been shaped by Tom and his guidance. One of Tom's friends, Phil Johnson, referred to Tom as navigator for their circle of friends and readers. Tom was an excellent navigator and also a supreme example of why we need good historians. He was a wordsmith and reveled in language study, including his enthusiastic participation during the Swedish summer program at Grebbestad. Dag Blanc notes how Tom played with and even tasted the language. The poem also reflects the broad sweep of Tom's interests, his brilliant mind, and his optimism. I inherited a dark wood where I seldom walk, but there comes a day when the dead and the living trade places. Then the woods will start to move. We aren't without hope. The worst crimes remain unsolved despite the work of many police. Just so, there is somewhere in our lives a great unsolved love. I inherited a dark wood, but today I'm walking in another wood, the light one, and the living creatures that sing, wiggle, wag, and crawl. It's spring, and the air is really strong. I have a degree from the University of Forgetting, and I'm as empty-handed as a shirt on a clothesline. Jag ärvde en mörk skog dit jag sällan går. Men det kommer en dag när de döda och levande byter plats. Då sätter sig skogen i rörelse. Vi är inte utan hopp. De svåraste brotten förblir ouppklarade trots insats av många poliser. På samma sätt finns någonstans i våra liv en stor ouppklarad kärlek. Jag ärvde en mörk skog, men idag går jag i en annan skog, den ljusa. Allt levande som sjunger, slingrar, viftar och kryper. Det är vår, och luften är mycket stark. Jag har examen från Glömskans universitet och är lika tomhänt som skjortan på tvättsträcket.
Well, I had Tredway for class, and he would ding me if I didn't relate one piece of history, and that is the first time he heard Janina Ehrlich play Mendelssohn's Song Without Words was shortly after she had successfully defended her thesis. And he made a point of lifting that up to all those who were gathered that day. And so I think it's appropriate that in that spirit, we lift up once again all of the things that people like Dr. Safstrom and Dr. Ehrlich and Dr. Schmidt and Dr. Hilton-Morrow and all the other faculty here do day in and day out. Would you join me in thanking them? In a moment, a benediction for the class of 1990 that today will be for all of us. But first, a benediction for those who are not now in our midst. This room has hosted such thinkers as William Styron, Carolyn Forche, and Maria Hinojosa. But before it was a venue, it was a library reading room where kids like Tom Tredway of North Tonawanda, New York, came to study and have their lives changed irremediably. Today there's a whole library named for him. May his spirit forever be present whenever a student visits the Tredway Library and leaves other than they entered. And now, may the gifts of God be yours. Eyes that see beauty within and beyond mere appearance. Ears that hear the sounds and silences of all creation. Hands willing to touch the untouchables of the earth. Feelings capable of more than simply feeling good. Minds that think good for all. Hearts that love even the unlovable. Deeds to match your gifts. All of these and all the rest. May the gifts of God be yours. In the name of Jesus, amen.
In the opening prayer, I invited us to acknowledge Tredway's spirit among us. And I imagine him being in our midst, listening, perhaps being with us as we are inspired by his story. And I imagine that he would see that as time lost if we were not in turn to be inspired to live our own lives with our own gifts and our own specific ways of being in the world. So thank you to Tredway's beautiful example for being so present with and among us. But may we now go to live out our own lives inspired by our own specific gifts to go into a world that desperately needs us. May his memory live in us and inspire us this day and always. Go in peace.